big. It's the way to go. Eat a fig, not a pig. Let your kindness show. If it's your wig or a jig or a swig, do you dig? Big. It's the way to go. It's Big Fat Vegan Radio.
When something's fat, there's a lot to show. It's gotta be fat to help the movement grow. Making fat loud chat that won't be flat. It's fat. And here's our show. It's Big Fat Vegan Radio.
I just got that vegan glow, like a drag queen calling Patrick Goudreau. I'm a YouTube beacon cooking up good eating. Veganism makes me glow. It's Big Fat Vegan Radio.
All right, vegans, all together now. When something's fat, there's a lot to show. It's gotta be fat to help the movement grow. Making fat loud chat that won't be flat. It's
big
fat.
It's the way to go.
It's Big Fat Vegan Radio.
Okay, Ben just did a pit check, everyone.
You can't smell me, it's okay.
Ben just did a pit check.
I can't tell if I smell lovely or if I need some help.
Before we launch into this episode, Ben did a pit check.
Yesterday was one of those don't shower days. I just kind of went through my life. But we built a wig shelf. It's fabulous. I'll show you later.
When drag queen's room. Hey everyone, welcome to Big Fat Vegan Radio. We're podcasting from San Francisco
and New York City
to discuss veganism in all of its glory. I'm here with Ben Strothman, otherwise known as Honey LeBronx, everyone's favorite vegan drag queen.
And I'm here with Laura Yaz, vegan writer and entertainment know-it-all.
You can check us out on Twitter and Facebook by searching for Big Fat Vegan Radio.
And you can follow along with our show notes at bigfatveganradio.com.
We've got an awesome interview episode today for you guys, and I'm really excited about it. We were contacted by some people over at the Center for Constitutional Rights interested in spreading the word about their case against a bill that I'm sure a lot of you have heard about. And we were lucky enough to be able to interview one of the attorneys on the case. Ben, do you want to tell us about her? She's pretty cool.
Yeah, sadly, Laura passed away right before the interview, so she wasn't able to actually join me on the call.
I did. I died, and I had to attend my funeral.
Yeah. Oh, how was it?
It was great. Oh, my God. I've been looking forward to it my whole life.
I've always wanted at my funeral, I want to have, whatever happens to me, I want an open casket. But I want to be slightly propped up. Like, everyone lays flat, right? That's been done.
Like, you want to be taxidermied?
No. I just want a slight wedge pillow so that instead of laying flat, like, from the waist up, I'm kind of at a slight incline. It'll be such a slight, imperceptible difference in my showing.
You're sick.
That people will be like, I'm uncomfortable, but I'm not sure why. Is he propped up? Yeah.
I want to donate my body to science.
Yeah, I want to donate my body all over.
Seriously? I'm serious.
Yeah, no, I'm an organ donor now.
Yeah, I don't just mean organs. I mean, like, if I die in some way that my organs can't be donated, I want them to give my cadaver to medical students. Like, I want to be donated to science.
And what this has to do with the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, our listeners are probably wondering.
We should probably...
nothing. It has nothing to do with the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act.
For our tangential tendencies.
Yeah, well, you can. So Laura did come back from the dead, and we will interview her about that after the interview.
My life has continued on. Everything's fine, guys. Don't worry. Thanks for your concern.
I was going to say you fell down a well, and then we were all concerned, and we started calling you baby, and then someone thought your name was Jessica, but it wasn't. But the news picked it up, and anyway. So our guest today, Rachel Meeropol, has worked at the Center for Constitutional Rights since 2002. She is the co-editor and primary author of the Jailhouse Lawyers Handbook, a widely requested resource for prisoners, and the editor of America's Disappeared, Secret Imprisonment, Detainees, and the War on Terror, published by Seven Stories Press in 2005. Rachel is currently lead counsel on Turkmen versus Ashcroft, the class action lawsuit on behalf of Arab and Muslim men rounded up in immigration sweeps after 9/11, and Blum versus Holder, a First Amendment challenge to the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. She also represents federal prisoners held in the Bureau of Prisons' secretive communication management units in Aref versus Holder.
With that, let's just jump right to it. So enjoy our interview with Rachel Meeropol.
So today joining us, we have Rachel Meeropol from the Center for Constitutional Rights. Rachel, welcome to Big Fat Vegan Radio.
Thanks. It's great to be on.
Thanks so much. How do I properly pronounce your last name?
Meeropol.
Meeropol. Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. Like miracle, but with a P.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've certainly been called Rachel Miracle on occasion, but, I try to be a little more humble than that.
Okay. You know what? I almost think that's the perfect way to kick off this interview, so I may or may not use that as our introduction. We would love to talk to you today and educate our listeners about the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. Can you tell people who might never have heard of that before what that is?
Absolutely. So the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, or the AETA, as we sometimes refer to it, is a federal criminal law that was passed in 2006 that criminalizes damaging or causing the loss of real or personal property belonging to an animal enterprise or connected somehow to an animal enterprise. Now, at first blush, this doesn't sound so unusual. The problem with the law really comes in the lack of definitions and the breadth with which courts are holding that it applies. So the law doesn't say, that an individual has to individually actually cause physical damage to property belonging to an animal enterprise. Rather, it talks about causing damage or loss. And because the loss isn't defined, it means that, for example, if you cause a company to lose profit or expend money to hire extra security guards, that can actually be read as a violation of the Act. So an individual who organizes a boycott of a restaurant that serves foie gras, if the boycott is successful and the restaurant loses business because individuals don't want to eat there, that person could find themselves guilty of animal enterprise terrorism. The Act is incredibly broad. An animal enterprise is defined in the law as any company or organization that uses or sells animal products, or any company or organization that somehow contracts with or is involved with a company that uses or sells animal products. So a university that has a cafeteria, a Walmart that sells beef jerky. It's hard to really think of any corporation that isn't covered now by this law.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like just about every single corporation and industry and bodega and wherever you go, everyone's pretty much got their hands on the animals and is some way profiting off of them.
Exactly.
So, Rachel, one other thing that we would like to get into today is the case of the Shack 7. Could you just start by telling us a little bit, for someone who's never heard of the Shack 7 and maybe might think that that's a basketball player, could you let us know a little bit about who that is and how they factor into the AETA?
Sure. So SHAC stands for Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, and it's a group that surfaced in response to information disclosed about the practices of Huntington Life Sciences, which is a corporation, a multinational corporation that does experimentation on animals. And undercover investigation disclosed just absolutely shocking and disgusting videos of HLS scientists doing things like repeatedly punching beagle puppies in the face and other acts of cruelty toward animals. In response, there was a lot of organizing against the company in sort of apartheid-era tactics. Organizers tried to encourage corporations that do business with Huntington Life Sciences to sever their ties to that company. And there were a lot of acts carried out by individuals who were opposed to Huntington's techniques that included, everything from lawful protests, spreading information about what Huntington was doing, showing the videos, educating the public, and then also included some illegal tactics, unpermitted demonstrations, some property destruction, a wide range of tactics by a wide segment of people in the animal rights movement. The Shack 7 are individuals who ran a website devoted to the Shack movement. They were not personally alleged to have physically damaged any Huntington Life Sciences property. Rather, the allegations against them were simply that by running a website that reported on the lawful and unlawful tactics that animal rights activists were engaging in this campaign against HLS, that in itself caused the business to lose money, caused other corporations to actually divest, to stop doing business with HLS, that HLS spent money on increased security in response, and that because of this, the Shack 7 were guilty of animal enterprise terrorism for violating the Animal Enterprise Protection Act. Now, this was actually a precursor to the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And the Shack 7 prosecution was really one of the reasons why the AETA came into being. Even though the United States succeeded in prosecuting these activists who were never shown to have committed any property destruction, one of the ways that, even though it succeeded in convicting them, prosecutors argued that they needed even more heightened protection. And there's a lot of talk in that period and continuing to this day about this idea of animal rights activists as dangerous terrorists, as individuals who, actually who could potentially harm other human beings, who are engaged in just serious acts of destruction and mayhem, despite the fact that, no animal rights activist in this country has ever harmed another human being. But still, despite that reality, you have things like the FBI referring to animal rights activists as the number one domestic terrorist threat in this country. So with that sort of out of that context, the government argued that the Animal Enterprise Protection Act was not powerful enough to protect these vulnerable animal enterprises. And that was sort of where the idea for the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act that ratcheted up penalties, included new offenses, and expanded the definition of an animal enterprise to cover organizations that do business with animal enterprises but aren't actually animal enterprises themselves. That's where the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act came from.
Okay. So can I speculate here? The Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty movement, the people that were actually causing damage to property and other shenanigans that they were up to, were those activists ever actually caught or tried or brought to quote-unquote justice?
No, not at all. And I think that that's one of the realities we face when we're part of a movement that has sort of an above ground and an underground component. Mm-hmm. The individuals who are engaging in more serious crimes, engaging in property destruction, they are not the public face of the movement. They, operate on the underground by necessity. They don't want to get caught. And then on the other hand, you have individuals who are vocally coming out in support of animal rights and sometimes expressing support for the tactics that others engage in. Support that should, of course, be protected by the First Amendment. It's lawful to say, I believe in property destruction. It's lawful to say that there are times when these tactics are necessary. So those people feel, and have felt confident that they can stand up and say these things while continuing to be, out front about their politics and their organizing. And so it's those sort of above-ground activists who are really targeted by the Animal Enterprise Protection Act and the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. The folks who are operating, underneath the law here it doesn't affect them one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds to me as just a listener who's learning about this, in depth for the first time, that, well, they can't really catch the people who did this, so they're going to catch anyone they can get who is connected in any way, even if those people are completely acting within the law, just to set a precedent, because this law has terrified the animal rights community. Just
it has.
a bit of personal background, as a gay rights activist, myself and several friends, we were willingly arrested last year, March, for blocking traffic as an act of civil disobedience to demand attention for marriage equality in New York State. And a lot of people pat me on the back for that. And they're like, oh, that's so wonderful that you did that. And I'm like, the truth is, it's real easy to fight for gay rights because that's a popular cause. I would have been terrified to do the same thing on behalf of an animal enterprise, because then you have some real stark realities. Like, you may go to prison, or I might be considered a terrorist.
Well, it's a very important point you raise, and I think it's really important not just to draw the distinction between sort of lawful, protected First Amendment protest and then unlawful activities, but to also think about, where civil disobedience falls on that spectrum. Civil disobedience, of course, is not protected by the law. You can go to prison for it. You can be charged for it. But it has this recognized place in our history that I think most people would support this idea that it is it is an ethical thing to do. It can be an important part of social movements, dating back to Dr. King, that it is, this revered way to express disapproval for public policy. And yet, under the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, civil disobedience done in the name of animal rights is an act of terrorism.
Wow. It just makes me think back to the time where George Bush, our great former president, George Bush, do you love him? I do. Well, he was talking about, whichever enemy du jour we were rallying against, and he's saying, they hate us because we're so free.
Yeah.
And I mean, I feel like we're raised. I remember just being a kid, and all I knew was to say, oh, well, it's a free country. Well, it's a free country. And, I never really knew or questioned what that meant. But I just took it to mean like, oh, yeah, what makes us unique is our exceptional freedom here. And we have all this freedom. But, you just keep saying that all your life and you'll really believe that we're free. But you look at stuff like this, and I mean, this flies in the face of what we say this country's about in the first place.
Yeah, well, some folks are a lot more free than other folks. That's true.
Oh, amen. So the Shack 7, just to give our listeners some background here, can you tell us who the Center for Constitutional Rights is and how they came to become involved with the Shack 7?
Sure. So the Center for Constitutional Rights is a nonprofit legal and educational organization. We were formed in the 1960s, sort of as the legal arm of the civil rights movement. We were organized to give legal support to civil rights activists in the South who were facing criminal charges, and to sort of allow for litigation in the aim of furthering social movements. So since then, we've been involved in a broad array of sort of domestic and international civil rights and human rights work. We're sort of best known in this era probably for our leadership on behalf of the Guantanamo detainees and for a lot of sort of the cutting-edge litigation against Bush-era abuses, and many of those abuses, unfortunately, have now become Obama-era abuses as well. So CCR became involved in the Shack 7 case quite a few years ago. Immediately after their conviction, we appeared as amici, which is Latin for friend of the court. Basically, we entered the case to argue to the appellate court that the Shack 7 prosecutions and convictions violated the First Amendment. That, the speech that the Shack 7 were involved in, the speech on their website, the organizing they did not rise to the level of incitement. Incitement is speech that can be punished because it poses a imminent threat to public safety, and that their speech did not rise to the level of incitement. It did not constitute a true threat against any individual. That's a threat that can lawfully be punished, and that because of this, the convictions could not stand, that they had to be overturned. And we continued to support the Shack 7 in their appeals up to the time when they petitioned the Supreme Court for review of their case, and unfortunately lost. So after the Shack 7, CCR's work sort of supporting animal rights activists and trying to sort of bring this issue to the attention of the broader civil rights and social justice community. And I think one of the issues that the animal rights community faces is that, it's not a movement that experiences a lot of support from the larger social justice community as a whole. And I think that that's been part of the reason why there could be laws like this that, I think if the broader public knew about, they would be really outraged.
Yeah.
And they should know about them because actually the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act and the Animal Enterprise Protection Act, while they're targeted at animal rights activists and they've been used against animal rights activists, they actually could be applied to any activist working for any cause. The protections adhere to animal enterprises. So, and we've talked about how broad that is. But the law doesn't require that an individual who causes a company to lose profit do that, out of motivation of protecting animal rights. So if sort of, labor protesters were going to picket Walmart over its labor practices, and they caused Walmart to lose business, well, that actually could be punished as animal enterprise terrorism as well. The law is just that broad.
Yeah. Yeah, it really, that's to me what the scary thing is about this act, because it sounds to me like it almost sounds like it comes down to personalities, like, what, I don't like this activist, let's use this law to put him away, or, this guy's going to be a thorn in our side, he's a threat to us, we got to deal with him, we've now got this law which basically gives us sole discretion over, how to put people away or handle them.
I think that's absolutely right. And a law that is so broad, that allows so much unfettered discretion, that's a constitutional problem in itself. And it's one of the reasons that we're challenging the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act on something called overbreath, under something called overbreath analysis. So basically what overbreath means is that the Constitution doesn't permit the existence of a criminal law that is so broad that it can be used to punish activity that's consistent with the First Amendment. And the Constitution doesn't permit, a law that's so broad that prosecutors and police officers have completely unfettered discretion to decide who they'd like to prosecute. And that's just what the AETA does.
That's one of the funny things to me about law. I mean, I was contemplating this just last night, and I was thinking, I'm not one of the most politically aware or legally aware people. And, I often think how easy it would be in this country or in this city or state to break a law without knowing it. Because, as far as I know, they're not really posted anywhere, it's like you don't see them on a poster on the subway. They're not proudly displayed somewhere on Google or Facebook that we can all access them. And they're also changing all the time. So for all we know, there might be a law about this or about that, and I don't know it. And how do I know that I've broken it? And it sounds to me like the law comes down to whether or not you know about it. And if something is the law, for example, I've learned that it's not illegal for police officers to lie. A police officer can lie to me to get information from me, and that he is perfectly within the law doing so. However, if I lie to an officer, that is against the law, and I've just broken it. So, I mean, it really sounds like the law is on the side of whoever knows the law and knows what they can get away with. And it sounds here like the Constitution, like this is already against the law, but if no one knows that, then they can go on and do whatever they want until someone steps up to the plate to stop this.
Well, I think that's true, and I think the sort of reasonable expectations that people might have about, what the law permits and what it prohibits and how acts will be punished is another really important point when considering the AETA. Many folks might feel like, I feel okay with the idea of committing civil disobedience. I understand it's against the law, but I also understand that people who end up getting arrested for that usually don't serve any jail time at all, or if they do, it's 24 hours and it's really not that big a deal. Mm-hmm. Or, okay, maybe my actions in attending this unpermitted protest could be punished as trespass under state law, and that's a risk I'm willing to take. But if those folks knew that actually their actions could be prosecuted as an act of terrorism under the Animal Enterprise Protection Act or the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, well, that's a really different thing to face, and it's a different calculus for people to engage in, and that's exactly what was intended here. I think that in pushing that this law be passed, the sort of corporations whose bottom lines are served by acts like this, we're hoping to silence the entire movement as a whole, not just the sort of radical fringe of the movement who engage in property destruction.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I mean, it was effective because as an activist, I think twice, before getting involved in an action. I think, is this something that I could be put away for? And I mean, I'm the kind of guy that, like, if I knew that I'm not going to be put away for something, if I knew that I might not risk going to prison, if it just means getting something on my record or a little jail time, I'm like, hey, I'm down, but this has really changed the game. So can you tell us how in this country did this kind of a thing actually become a law?
Well, there are a couple different elements here. I mean, I think one of the first pieces of the puzzle is to understand the sort of extremely rich and powerful lobbying groups who were really behind the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And that includes, the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, which is this super scary group who draft proposed state and federal legislation and then lobby for those bills to become law. It includes groups like the Animal Enterprise Protection Coalition, the Center for Consumer Freedom. There was a lot of support by sort of the people you would expect, the National Association for Biomedical Research, the Fur Commission, Pfizer, United Egg Producers, those sort of interests. There was a big push on Congress to amend the Animal Enterprise Protection Act and pass the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And on the other side, there really just wasn't any organized outcry. I mean, it's not fair to say not any. There were a few organizations who recognized what was going on and stood up. And I'm proud that the Center for Constitutional Rights has viewed this issue as a civil rights issue for quite a long time now, when many other organizations have not. But I think, a lot of that lack of opposition comes from what I was talking about before, from the fact that the larger social justice community, by and large, hasn't treated animal rights activists and the animal rights movement as a legitimate part of a larger sort of social justice community and social justice movement. Yeah. And we have to begin to make those ties and ensure that the larger community sees the way that these activists are being silenced, because that is a civil rights issue, and it's a civil rights issue that should resonate across different movements and across different issues. Yeah. So the law was passed in 2006. It had very broad support, and we've been with it ever since.
This kind of reminds me of there's the old, first they came for the communists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the socialists, et cetera, and then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. There's several different versions of that one, of course, but I feel it's time to write the animal version of this,
First they came for the animal rights activists.
Yeah.
That's true.
It really could start, that way and work its way down. But I mean, I've as a gay person, I've been involved in a social rights movement, you could say, my whole life. And it's, for such a long time, it's been a movement of trying to get people to see my fight as their fight, trying to get people to see my plight as their own, or at least as being worthy of their empathy. And I remember, I don't know, when I was a kid, I was watching some documentary or some interview with leaders of the African American community, and this one woman was saying how, people in her community, when talking about gay rights, are like, oh, that isn't my fight. That isn't my fight. And she's like, this is absolutely your fight. What's being done to them is the same thing that is being done to us, and we have to stand with them in solidarity. And, I feel like when I talk about animal rights with people, some people, I feel like, gay rights is not even the current social justice movement. I feel it has been the social justice movement for a very long time. And I'm not saying we're done. We have a long way to go. As the LGBT community goes, I really feel like transgender issues are sort of becoming the new current modern day social justice movement, with animal rights on a dry erase board somewhere 5th or 7th on a to-do list of causes we might get to one day if we don't run out of time. And for me to get especially other people in the gay rights movement to recognize the parallels between these communities, I think it was Dan Matthews of PETA who put it so well when he talked about a fishing trip he went on with his dad. And when he and his friends were gathered over the, floundering body of this fish out of water, he realized, he's like, oh my God, we are hovering over this innocent victim, just like they once were like, towering over me, beating me up in school. And there he got it, he realized, oh wow, this is the same thing that was being done to me. And just to finish this tangent, I always say that we've always heard, be the change that you want to see in the world. And if I, as a gay man, am going to beg the world to go to bat on my behalf, to give me my equality, to give me rights that they might never benefit from directly, I have to be willing to do the same for the next guy. And the next guy, in this case, are the animals.
Eloquently put.
Oh, I thank you. So let's discuss then. I've always thought, what can we do? What can we do about the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, and how can we possibly fight or challenge this? Well, it sounds to me like the Center for Constitutional Rights currently is working on a case.
That's right. So just this year, we filed a federal constitutional challenge to the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. We're asking that the law be struck down as unconstitutional in violation of the First Amendment and due process. So we brought the case in Massachusetts on behalf of several animal rights activists who have long histories of work in various facets of the animal rights movement. For example, one of our plaintiffs, Sarah Jane Blum, has largely been involved in anti-foie gras work. She was instrumental in producing this film, Delicacy of Despair, which featured undercover footage from a foie gras farm showing just the incredible abuses and cruelty that were occurring there. And so Ms. Blum talks in the lawsuit about the way in which she would like to continue her anti-foie gras work. She lives in Minnesota now. Minnesota is actually home now to some foie gras producers, and she wants to continue to educate the public about what foie gras is, how it's produced, and the way that the animals are treated on these farms. But she's chilled from talking about her work, from showing the film that she produced several years ago, from urging people to not eat at restaurants that serve foie gras because of fear that she could be prosecuted under the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act as an animal rights terrorist. She engaged in undercover investigation in the past. She risked going to prison at a time in her life, but with the understanding that, the kind of the trespass that was involved there maybe would be a violation of state law, could result in prison time, but that is a very different thing than being prosecuted as a terrorist. Yeah. And it's this, with the passage of the AETA, she no longer feels able to engage, forget trespass, but even in perfectly lawful First Amendment protected activity that could be seen to violate the AETA. So the lawsuit argues that the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act is unconstitutional on several levels. As I mentioned earlier, we argue that it's overbroad because of the way that you could be prosecuted under the Act for engaging in perfectly lawful activities that damage the bottom line of an animal enterprise, that cause a corporation to lose profit in a way that should be protected by the First Amendment. We argue that the law is so vague that it violates due process, that, it's hard to understand exactly what's being punished here. And because it's hard to understand, because the terms are undefined, prosecutors have unfettered discretion to decide who they want to prosecute under the law, and that violates due process. We also argue that the law unfairly singles out individuals who would harm the profits of animal enterprises for heightened prosecution, while ignoring, others who might commit identical acts that don't damage the bottom line of animal enterprises, and that this kind of discriminatory enforcement violates the First Amendment. Mm-hmm. So we, as I said, we filed the case this year. The government immediately moved to dismiss the case, arguing that the law is perfectly constitutional and that all it's really about is going after individuals who actually physically damage animal enterprises, even though, of course, that's not what the law says, and that's not what the past usage of the law shows. But they filed that motion, and the court heard argument on the question of whether our lawsuit can go forward just this past August. And we're now waiting for the judge to decide what will happen in the case.
There's just one thing I wanted to back up and perhaps clarify for our listeners. So, the Shack 7, under this law, what exactly happens to these activists who are found guilty of terrorism? Like, what was the actual punishment for them, if you're at liberty to...
Sure. The Shack 7 served varying sentences. I believe they were between maybe 1 and 5 years in prison. Mm-hmm. It's something in that range. Another important aspect of being convicted as a terrorist is the way you're treated in prison and the kind of conditions of confinement you can expect to face. One of the Shack 7 actually ended up being sent to something called a communications management unit within the Federal Bureau of Prisons. We've also seen other sort of activists, like environmental activists, be sent to these units. And these are sort of isolation units within the Federal Bureau of Prisons, where individuals live under extremely restrictive conditions, with limited visitation rights, no ability to have contact visits whatsoever. So that means all visits, including with your family, your friends, happen through glass over the telephone. They have very limited telephone access, and they're segregated from the rest of the prison population. so because of the fact that these crimes come with a tag of terrorism on them, it's sort of a justification for activists to face heightened restrictions while in prison.
Wow. I mean, wow. Oh my God.
And the Center for Constitutional Rights actually also has a case challenging the communications management units.
Yeah.
So if any of your listeners are interested in learning more about that issue as well, and I should give the website plug early and often, I encourage people to go to CCR's website, which is ccrjustice.org, to learn about the CMU case and the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act case, which is called Blum v. Holder.
Okay. Yeah, we're definitely going to include links to that in our show notes because that's exactly what we want people doing. I mean, you're talking about isolation and confinement, and we were talking before the interview that I actually saw a video in which you were interviewed about death row and the torture that people actually endure leading up to being executed. This is sort of an aside from what we're talking about, but I mean, prison isn't just like grown-up jail. I mean, the actual anguish. I mean, I'm just trying to imagine right now the actual anguish of being that isolated, and for as much as 5 years. I mean, some of these people, for essentially just running a website and reporting on something, basically just giving their opinion on the internet.
It is really shocking. It is really shocking, and people should be shocked about it.
Yeah. People should be angry about it and motivated to do something about it. So, currently, what is the status of the case? How's it going?
So we're waiting for the judge to tell us whether the case can move forward. With cases of this nature, it's very common for the defendants in the case to ask the judge to dismiss the case, without it going to trial, without the case really proceeding. And basically what happens is this sets up a legal argument between the attorneys for both sides, where we both try to convince the court of the central legal question in the case. So what the judge has been asked to rule on is, whether we have adequately argued that the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, if it does what we say it does, violates the Constitution. And then if we're allowed to move forward, if the judge rules in our favor, at that point you get into something called discovery, where the sides exchange documents, relevant factual information, and then there can be a trial. In a case like this, where there's really just a central legal issue, there's not a factual dispute between the parties, getting a judge to rule on what the law is and what it means is really a major part of the struggle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, it sounds so much like David versus Goliath here, because it's some grassroots activists going to bat up against major corporations with virtually unlimited resources, especially when those people are lobbying to have these laws written in the first place. It sounds like
that's our favorite kind of case at CCR.
Yeah.
That's our bread and butter.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like someone could really easily lose hope. I mean, it must take a really special type to fight for this so diligently.
Well, I think it's like being involved in any other movement. If you know about these kind of abuses that are going on and you're not involved in doing anything to stop them, then that's when it gets really dispiriting. And that's when I think people can sort of just fall into despair. Being involved in the struggle is motivating in itself, and it's fulfilling in itself, and it allows you to meet and interact with amazing people. The animal rights movement is not a movement that I really came out of. I come from more of a straight civil rights background. Getting involved in this work, learning about the issues that are involved, has allowed me to interact with just wonderful activists and learn about sort of a whole new area of work that I didn't know about before. So it's really a pleasure to engage in this kind of work.
So is there any particular plaintiff that you can tell us a bit about, their struggle or their experience as part of the Shack 7?
Sure. Well, one of the plaintiffs in Blum v. Holder in our case challenging the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act is Lauren Gazzola. And Lauren was actually one of the Shack 7. She served time in federal prison, based simply, as we've talked about, on running this website, reporting on lawful and unlawful activities. And after getting out of prison, decided that she wanted to be involved in challenging the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. Now, for Lauren, it's especially poignant. You know, she actually spent time in prison after being convicted of violating the Animal Enterprise Protection Act. So it makes complete sense that she would feel chilled from engaging in lawful activity. You know, she wants to be able to re-engage on a lawful basis. She wants to educate people about, Huntington Life Sciences or other organizations that engage in animal cruelty. And she feels unable to because she doesn't want to go back to prison. So it's I think, especially poignant to have someone like that in the case challenging this law who's already experienced just such intense repression under the precursor statute. I'll add that Lauren also works at the Center for Constitutional Rights now in our communications department. So that's another example of what I mentioned, of just being involved in this work, being an avenue to meet just wonderful people.
Yeah. So for those people who are listening out there, who want to get involved, who want to show their support, and God willing, see you guys actually win this case and overturn the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, what could our listeners do to help spread the word, to help out in the fight?
Well, so there's a few things, and one of the first is just the most basic, to support organizations like the Center for Constitutional Rights who are engaged in this work. As I mentioned, there really just aren't very many civil rights organizations out there who are recognizing the way in which animal rights activists' rights are being silenced. And I think if folks who are involved in the animal rights movements sort of seek out and become involved in the organizations that are drawing links between sort of the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act and a larger civil rights struggle, that those are really important relationships to nurture and to move forward. So I really encourage people to go to CCR's website, ccrjustice.org, to learn about Blum v. Holder, to learn about our other sort of green scare defense work, and to get involved in that way. One of the other sort of most important ways people can get involved right now is what your listeners are doing right now, which is learning about the law. Mm-hmm. I'm sure many people have never heard of it before, and many of the people who are being educated now would do a wonderful service if they just talked to 4 or 5 of their friends about the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act.
Yeah.
And explain to them what it is. And it doesn't have to just be people in the animal rights movement. Talk to your friends in the animal rights movement about what's happening, but talk to people in any social justice movement, because as I said, this is a law that is broad enough to actually be applied to people across the political spectrum, applied to anyone who might think that their activism would be served by forcing a corporation to listen to their demands, by affecting that corporation's bottom line, by showing this corporation that that their practices could be expensive for them, because once the public is educated about how they behave. The other things I would also recommend is that there has been a continued push to abolish the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, to get Congress to either amend the law or repeal it. And folks, it's always a good idea to write to your elected officials and explain where you stand on an issue. It is my hope that the question of the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act will come up at some point for repeal or at least amendment. And if folks are out there educating their elected officials about their stances, that's going to make that fight much easier.
Excellent. And, we'll have links to all that in the show notes so that people can follow up on that as well. One of the things about this this particular law that I think makes it so easy to hook people's interest is it's got such a great buzzword built right into it. I mean, what people in this country picture when they think of a terrorist, is just not what we're calling a terrorist in this situation. And for me to explain to people that by me doing this, that, or the other, I could be considered a terrorist, I think that's where people just feel, where they get a sense for the utter lunacy of this law, and that it's not, serving to protect us as citizens, as individuals, So I have found that it's really an eye-opening conversation to have with people in or out of the animal rights movement, that they're just really shocked to hear, the details of it, and that they, if you explain it to them, they inherently are like, yeah, that's absolutely wrong. That absolutely should not exist as a law.
Yeah, I like to tell people about the very first prosecution under the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, which was against a group of activists out in California who came to be known as the AETA 4. And they were charged with trespassing onto the front lawn of some professors' homes and chanting slogans about animal abuse. And they were charged with animal enterprise terrorism and conspiracy and faced 10 years in prison each for those protests.
Oh my God.
Happily, the Center for Constitutional Rights and other lawyers succeeded in getting those charges dismissed. But that's what terrorism looks like in this country now.
That just reminds me of here in New York City. I know that it's been a very popular tactic that, people have protested on Bloomberg's, as close as they can get to his front lawn or as close as they can get to his property. I mean, that kind of sounds like the same thing here, that for doing that, if it was in the name of animals, that's considered terrorism.
Absolutely.
Yikes. So for activists out there who, another great word that has come up in this conversation, chilled, and it's just so the perfect word, like I'm fired up, bam, I'm dropped in ice water and I'm no longer fired up. That's exactly what it is. Chilled. What would you say to activists who want to get involved in this social justice movement, but are afraid to take any action because of the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act?
Well, I think that's one of the hardest questions that I get asked in doing that work, because the last thing in the world I want to do is chill people from engaging in this important work. Yet on the other hand, as a lawyer, I read the law and I read it incredibly broadly. And I think that there are just a ton of actions that people can take that they might think were lawful that could actually subject them to prosecution under the Act. Now, there haven't been that many Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act prosecutions, and hopefully there won't be many more. And hopefully those prosecutions won't be of individuals who, are engaging in purely protected sort of protest and public education. But I can't say that they won't. I can't say that's not allowed under the law. So it's an incredibly hard thing to advise people about. I guess what I would have to say to those activists is to understand the law, understand how it has been used, and then make a decision for yourself about what you're willing to risk.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's certainly not as as hopeful as I was hoping to end this on. But I mean, that's just the scary reality, is that
it is.
This is who we're up against, and they want to stop at nothing. So I mean, this is why I really feel that if we unify as a movement to really make abolishing the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act our main focus, that's really the biggest thing we got to get out of the way before we can continue what I feel is so much steam that we've picked up as a movement. And I feel like if energy can neither be created nor destroyed, you cannot destroy the energy that has built up, the momentum that has built up in this movement. And it's just so ready and raring to go, that once we can get this thing out of the way. So for those out there who really want to get involved, really helping support this work is really one of the most important things that we can do.
Well, I certainly agree with that.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be too pessimistic either. So, there's got to be a way we can continue to fight, right?
Yeah. It always just comes down to creativity. Anytime someone's like, oh, no, it's impossible, I just think, a challenge. I like this. So, is there anything else you'd like to add? Is anywhere people can follow you or your work? You know, we've got ccrjustice.org.
No, I think that's most of it. But you know, I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Likewise, thank you so much for helping spread the word, and thanks so much for coming on Big Fat Vegan Radio.
Thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise, thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
All right.
Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Well, that's a great interview, Ben. That's awesome. Great job.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was a really exciting interview. I mean, this is just a case I have wanted to know so much more about.
I agree, because I feel like you hear a lot of clatter about it. And I didn't realize, I don't think that I actually understood that people had been convicted and been done time under this law. I didn't realize. I mean, I thought it was like this scary thing in the shadows. I didn't realize it was like this thing that is such a real day-to-day threat for activists, which I think just makes fighting it all the more important. So I really admire Rachel and everything she's doing. She's an incredible warrior.
Yeah. The fact that she's like representing people who have been in prison.
I know.
What she in for? The Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, she's amazing. And it's so cool that she took the time to spread the word. I hope that everyone shares this interview. I think that it's like really, really important, fascinating stuff. I feel like I learned so much just about it just through us doing this interview. It's incredible.
Yeah, this is exactly what we need to get the word out about, because when I first learned about the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, one of my first feelings was, well, that's it. I mean, they've got us. We're totally powerless. I mean, they've taken us out at the knees. They've rendered us completely ineffective. But I mean, they've done something that just cannot be done, I mean, quietly. I mean, this is something that's it's unconstitutional. It's completely against what America's all about. And I mean, I think if you talk to even non-vegans, even if you talk to non-activists about this, anyone would be like, well, no, that's against the rules. You just can't do that. It's
against our Constitution. That's the bottom line.
Yeah.
And so that's why we really need to stand up and let people know how problematic this is.
Yeah, I mean, I hate the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act so much. It flames on the side of my face, heaving breaths.
That's all we've got today for Big Fat Vegan Radio. Please subscribe to us through iTunes, give us a rating, and leave us a review.
And be sure to let us know what you thought of this episode on our Facebook page. Send us a tweet, leave us a voicemail, or leave us a comment at bigfatveganradio.com. We would love to hear from you. Before we go, we'd like to give a big fat vegan thank you to Michael Herron for our lovely theme song. You can find him at michaelherron.com, and you can follow him on Twitter at MikeyPod. And of course, we'd love to thank Kelly Huffine, as always, for our wonderful cartoon and logo. You can find her at kelly42fox.deviantart.com. And why not? One last shout out for me. You can find Honey LeBronx's Vegan Drag Queen cooking show at vegandragqueen.com. An exciting 6th episode is going up very soon, I promise. And I think that's about it. So thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Ben.
Have a great day, everyone. And there is one last thing. If you guys, if you guys aren't too busy, go vegan!
I just realized that this alarm is going to go off while recording, and it's going to play the marimba.
I just realized I have not turned my phone ringer off, but there I have.
I'm just going to go ahead and turn this timer off.
Okay, go ahead and turn the timer off,
but
and then I'm going
to... We need to get a move on, bucko.
Yeah, we do. Go.
Why did you tell everyone about our amazing interview subject, Rachel?
Yes. I was about to go on a tangent, but I guess I'll save it for another day. My dad was mad at my brother one day in a fight.
Ben!
And he didn't know what else to
That's
say.
not saving it
so
for
my dad
another
called
day.
my
That's
brother.
launching
My dad
into
called my
it.
brother go. My dad called my brother. He's like, you go. And my brother stops the fight. He's like, go. Okay.